welcome to Insiders. The federal government has been in some of the Aboriginal communities for a week now. We're witnessing the very early stages of a radical and ambitious project to combat child abuse. We have seen contrasting reactions from the communities. We have heard John Howard and his ministers tackle the details, and we have read mountains of opinion. And one initial conclusion, this was always going to be both difficult and divisive. Two interviews this week underline that. Rex Wild QC, a co-author of the report that inspired the government to act, spoke with Lateline Business, and Noel Pearson, the director of the Cape York Institute, spoke with Lateline. Rex Wild felt the government had gone in all guns blazing after ignoring key recommendations. Noel Pearson, on the other hand, was left flabbergasted with the critics.
The answer is to sit down with the people, work out what they need with them, provide them with assistance and support, which is both financial and in personnel on the ground, people they can work with, people that spend time with them, people that come and stay with them, not people who blow in for 5 minutes or 10 minutes here and there, descending from the sky like a swarm of locusts and then disappearing again. Now, I'm not saying we were God's messengers, but when we did our work, we were well received because we spent some time preparing the people for what was coming. The troops didn't arrive. We didn't arrive with a battleship. We arrived gently. Now we're not having that approach at all. We're just having the gunship set in.
How many of your 97 recommendations has the Prime Minister actually adopted?
I don't know if he's adopted any, but look, he certainly has targeted alcoholism, alcohol availability in communities, which you will know was one of the central planks of what we had to say. Other things like under 16 compulsory medical checks and the like form no part of our recommendations at all.
Then who is it that's advising the Prime Minister in devising his strategies?
Now, you're asking me a question I couldn't possibly answer, except I'll say this, nobody's phoned me from Canberra.
I'm amazed that anybody would put the protection of children secondary to anything. This is almost a form of madness. You know, that's the horrendous thing here. That the people who are naysaying any kind of intervention are people whose children, like my own, sleep safely at night. And I think that's a terrible indulgence. It's an absolutely shameful hour that has descended on us, absolutely shameful hour where even an emergency intervention to protect the safety of our children is hindered by people who supposedly have goodwill for Aboriginal people.
Now, Noel Pearson wasn't responding directly to Rex Wild there. In fact, Rex Wild's comments came the night after Pearson's appearance. But nevertheless, he is clearly frustrated with what he sees as nitpicking at the edges of a huge issue. And all the while, Kevin Rudd and Federal Labor, having initially offered bipartisan support, have stayed out of the day-to-day debate. But this morning, Labor's Shadow Minister for Indigenous Affairs, Jenny Macklin, will be our guest on Insiders. That's coming right up. But first, for the latest news headlines overnight, it's Good Morning, Katrina Blowers.
Thanks, Barry. Good morning. Britain has raised its national security to the highest level possible after another apparent terrorist attack at one of the country's biggest airports. A Jeep Cherokee was driven into Glasgow Airport and exploded into flames just metres from where holidaymakers were lined up at check-in counters. No one was seriously injured, but 2 people were arrested. One of them was on fire. One of the men was found to be wearing a suspect device. Police believe the apparent attack is linked to the twin car bomb plot foiled in London 2 days ago. In other news this morning, the states may be asked to provide more police to support the federal government's intervention in Indigenous communities. The Indigenous Affairs Minister says the first federal police officers will be deployed into Aboriginal communities later this week. He says it's possible more officers will be needed. In rugby, the Wallabies have scored an upset win against the All Blacks in last night's Bledisloe Cup match. The Australians trailed 15-6 at half-time but scored 2 tries in the second half to take the match 20-15. And Mark Viduka has broken his goal drought for the Socceroos, scoring 2 goals in Australia's 3-0 win over Singapore. And Barry, I'll be back with another news update at 11.
Katrina, thank you. And to our studio guest now, and the dominant issue for a second week is the Prime Minister's rescue mission into Aboriginal communities in the Northern Territory. Some of the Labor premiers in the states have criticised aspects of the Prime Minister's approach and in fact questioned his motives. But so far, federal Labor remains above the fray, having pledged bipartisan support at the outset. Labor's Shadow Minister for Indigenous Affairs is Jenny Macklin, and she joins me now. Good morning and welcome.
Thanks very much, Barry.
Well, you did pledge bipartisan support. Do you still feel comfortable with that?
We certainly do, because the protection of children is paramount. That really is the dominant issue here, and that's why we have pledged our bipartisan in principle support. There have been 13 or 14 reports on child abuse in different states and territories, reports to the federal government over the last 7 or 8 years. Every side of politics, every level of government has to take responsibility for the lack of action over that period of time. Now that we are seeing action, I think it's incumbent on all of us to act together to do whatever we can to protect these children.
What does in-principle support amount to? Is that a blank cheque?
We, of course, have yet to see the legislation that the government's proposing, but I just want to say at the outset we do support the urgent introduction of additional police into these communities. Many of the women, the grandmothers, the aunties, the people who've been protecting or doing their best to protect these children over the years have been crying out for additional police resources for a long time. So we certainly support getting extra police in there. We know how important it is also to get the extra doctors and nurses in there. So the urgent action is important, and we certainly support it.
You haven't seen the legislation yet, though. Do you reserve the right to criticise the legislation when you finally see it?
Well, the test for Labor will be, does this legislation deliver on making children safer? Will it actually make children safer? That'll be the test when we see the legislation. We haven't seen it yet. We haven't been informed when we will see the legislation or when the Parliament will be resumed.
But based on what you've seen and heard so far, you're comfortable that the legislation will target precisely what you're talking about?
Well, that really is the test, and it's a test the Prime Minister, I think, has to meet. He has to demonstrate in the legislation that he brings forward that it will make children safer. That's the test that will apply when we see the legislation.
Have you detected any unease within the party about your position so far?
Look, there's always going to be a variety of views. In the Labor Party, that's always the case. I imagine it's so in other political parties as well. I think, though, there's one thing that everybody agrees on, and I don't think this is just within the Labor Party. I think it's across the Australian community. We do want to see these shocking levels of child abuse dealt with once and for all. We can't any longer just sit back and have report after report, cries of help coming from grandmothers in remote communities being ignored. We all have to take our responsibility, and I think everybody's agreed on that.
Well, you talk about all of those reports. Alan Ramsey referred to one at the weekend about the Mehmet report in 2001. It talked about rape and sexual abuse, infants being raped and so on. Nothing was done then.
That's right.
Mick Dodson gave a speech to the Press Club in 2003. He spoke at length about this. Nothing was done. Now the Prime Minister has acted on, he says, based on this report, some television coverage and a radio interview. Are you at all sceptical about the timing of this?
Well, look, I can understand people's frustrations, especially people who've been working in this field for such a long time, like Mick Dodson. He is understandably saying he's been calling for these changes for 20 years. So we all do have to take our fair share of responsibility for lack of action, the Prime Minister and Labor. But let's put that to one side and see this now as an opportunity to finally deal with what are shocking levels of abuse. I think that's the way to look at it from here on. I don't really want to take any interest in the politics of this because of the terrible levels of abuse that are taking place, and I see this as an opportunity for finally dealing with it.
The premiers don't really share that approach. John Stanhope in the ACT has talked about it being racist. Alan Carpenter, a cynical political exercise. Mike Rann in South Australia has likened it to the invasion of Iraq. What do you say to their responses? Are they being unhelpful in all of this?
Well, the premiers obviously have their own points of view. Some of them I agree with, some of them I don't. But I can tell you from federal Labor's point of view, we have offered our bipartisan support to these efforts. We do think it's important to get these extra police and doctors in place urgently. These children need it. The grandmothers and the aunties have been calling for it for years. Let's get the protection in that these children need.
But you get the impression, certainly the government is starting to have its suspicions about this, that you're playing good cop, bad cop, that federal Labor is staying above the fray, but you're getting the premiers to do the work at that level.
Well, that's just not the case, and the Prime Minister can have that sort of cynical attitude if he wants to. I've made it very clear what our view is. We want to deal with this. We want to make sure that action is finally taken, urgent action, but also we recognise we're going to have to be in this for the long term because it's not all going to be fixed tomorrow.
But up until now, you claim with some justification that you've led on a lot of issues, but on this, you've got no choice but to follow.
Well, I think the important thing is to recognise that action is finally being taken. I don't think any of us have got clean hands on this. Labor governments in the past have not acted as they should have. The Prime Minister's had many reports that he too has ignored. Let's put all of that to one side and recognise that now that action is finally happening, we all need to work together to address it. Federal governments, state and territory governments, Indigenous communities, it's going to take concerted action on all of those fronts if we're to address these, what can only be described as shocking levels of abuse.
And yet you're saying there's been failure on all sides, and you're being very even-handed about that. The Prime Minister only yesterday said that it represents a great failure on the part of the states.
I really don't think that's very helpful for any of us to go down that path, blaming the states or the territories, or us blaming the federal government isn't going to fix child abuse. I think it's only going to be addressed if we do work together, if we stop blaming each other and really get in there, get the police on the ground, get the doctors on the ground, get the services upgraded so that the protection that these children deserve is really delivered.
Well, let's go to some of the details now. And you're satisfied that their approach on health checks are consistent with normal community standards? They started out by talking about compulsory testing. That's no longer the case.
It does seem to be the case that the government has changed its view and responded to the concerns of doctors, doctors like Dr Bill Glasson, who's on the task force. He made the comment in the media yesterday, which was very appropriate, I thought, that these health checks will need to be done very sensitively and carefully. I think the message from the medical profession is that in doing these checks, everybody must have at the front of their mind that no harm is done to these children. In many cases, a lot of harm has already been done, and I think the doctors really do understand just how careful they have to be.
So with that in mind, you would be urging Aboriginal families to cooperate?
I think Aboriginal families will want to have these health checks as long as they understand what the purpose is, and the purpose now is clearer than it was a week ago. It is about a general health check, looking for all the health problems that children might have, and I think parents will also want to know that there's going to be good follow-up. If children are found to have ear or eye infections, skin infections, they're going to want to know that the follow-up health services will be there for them. And
on tying the welfare payments to school attendance, I'm sure you feel that is practical and worthwhile, but are the schools there?
Well, that is really an enormous issue facing the Northern Territory. As we understand it, there are at least 2,000 children who are not even enrolled at school. So they're not even enrolled to go to school. And so what Labor is announcing today is that we will provide an additional $30 million so that 200 extra teachers can be employed in the Northern Territory, in these remote communities, to teach these 2,000 children. If these 2,000 children turned up at school tomorrow, there wouldn't be the teachers, there wouldn't be the classrooms for them to be taught in. So that's why Labor is announcing that we would invest this extra $30 million to teach these children. Federal money, we think it's urgently required to address the needs of these children.
Do these kids speak English?
They don't speak English as a first language, and that's why we've said that we would get an extra 200 teachers into these classrooms, because these children need additional support, intensive support, for them to be taught English as a second language.
Land rights, do you accept the need for the government to take back these rights? Is there no other way?
Well, we, of course, await to see the legislation. As I said before, what the test for us will be in any of these changes, is it necessary to make children safer? Will it work to make children in these communities safer? When we met with the Minister last week after the announcement, he indicated to us that the broader issues of land tenure would be kept separate from this urgent action to protect children, and I hope that's the case.
But do you still accept that it's necessary to lease back this land for 5 years?
Well, let's wait and see what the detail says when we see the legislation. I'll be judging all of these changes on the test of, will it make children safer?
But that is the detail, and the Prime Minister's already put that out there. He said they'll need to lease back the land for 5 years and then they'll return it. Why is there a need to lease back the land to make all this work?
Well, that's the question. The Prime Minister really has to demonstrate, why is it necessary to take this land back? Is there another way? These are the discussions and debates that we have to have with the government as this issue unfolds.
Just a couple of questions on stories arising from this morning's newspapers. There's a report that the government is considering an exit strategy of sorts, withdrawing troops from February next year.
Well, we know the Prime Minister's played politics with troops in and out of Iraq before. Just before the last election, John Howard promised that there wouldn't be any extra troops sent to Iraq. We had the election. After the election, another 450 troops were sent to Iraq. So, unfortunately, it's pretty hard to believe the Prime Minister on this issue.
There's another report written by one of our panellists, Glen Milne, that there's certainly some in the Liberal Party who are thinking about what if the Prime Minister loses Bennelong, that he might come back through a by-election in Mitchell.
Well, what this says to me, Barry, is that the Liberal Party are really saying to the people of Bennelong, if you feel that Maxine McHugh is doing a good job and you want to vote for her, go ahead and do so, because we'll look after the Prime Minister in a neighbouring seat, the neighbouring seat of Mitchell. It really does seem to be the case that the Liberal Party is saying to people, it's okay, you can vote Labor, we'll look after Mr Howard.
But they wouldn't be seriously considering this, surely. I mean, if he was to lose Bennelong, you would think they would take that as a fairly significant message.
You would think so, but this is a story that's appeared in the papers today, Barry. It does seem to be a message from the Liberal Party to voters in Bennelong, saying that you can go ahead and vote Labor. Maxine McHugh is doing a good job. If you think you'd like to have her as your Member of Parliament, we'll look after Mr Howard elsewhere.
Thanks for your time this morning.
Thanks, Barry.
I think it's very simplistic to look at this issue as just a good move to go into those communities. We have to look at a much bigger issue here, what's been going on in Australia for the last, since colonisation, really.
It's you. I actually live in a small community myself. If the Howard government is going to bring in the army to our community, that's going to, really scare the people in there.
I suppose there's a certain level of cynicism that he is choosing to act now. It sort of just seems like a heavy-handed approach that's come way too late.
It's one thing to say to oppose this plan is madness, but that should not negate the ability for people to question it.
Well, I think it's not actually a racist plan, but it's more or less an election plan.
I think we run the risk of this becoming racist when Aboriginal men are all dumped in the same box as being child abusers.
I actually hope that, whatever happens in the Northern Territory doesn't come to WA, because I suppose, some communities like my community is actually functioning pretty well without having an army to come through and tell us what to do in our community.
Isn't it bloody obvious that if you don't support communities with infrastructure, with health services, with education services, with policing, those sorts of basic things that any community has, that of course the community is going to fall apart. In Western Australia, you can go to a mining town and you can see everything there, from cinemas to swimming pools to the streets are paved, it's fantastic. Then you just go to a town down the road that's mostly Aboriginal people living there and there's nothing, you'll find a prison. But it needs to be thought out much more carefully and in dialogue with Aboriginal people, not about Aboriginal people.
What I think John Howard is actually doing something good is doing something about it now.
might not be the best way to go about it, but at least finally something is being done.
I would hope from my heart that the children actually benefit from this plan. How it manifests itself, I guess we're going to see in the long run. And I also hope that this is not a flash in the pan issue. We actually want to see change happen in our communities, but there's got to be a big shift in the psyche of Australia to do that.
Malcolm Farr, one point that comes through there is that he might not be going about it in the right way, but at least he's doing something about it. That seems to reflect a fairly strong view in the community.
I think there's overwhelming general support for what Howard has said he wants to do. Various degrees of reluctance attached to that because of certain scepticism as to the tactics of it. But I think Jenny Macklin made clear then that the Labor Party, and I think most people, would regard a lot of the criticism of the government's program as marginal, that the principal, and perhaps the only worthwhile debate is the implementation of Howard's program, and that the intentions of that program must be kept and must be kept until they're completed. And I think we're coming now, a week and a bit after Howard's announcement, to the quite solid position and a bipartisan position that we must make the most of this opportunity.
But federal Labor seems to be terrified of being at odds with the government, with the government on this. They won't be anxious to find a fault, will they, even in the legislation?
Well, this is the difficulty, I think. You know, it's been said many times that anyone who's criticising the methods are being seen to be against saving children from abuse, which of course is wrong. And there's always a danger in oversimplifying things, but I think everyone's a little bit frightened of trying to split hairs and criticise the method. I think criticising the method is legitimate. I think we need to have a debate about how these things should be done. But, you know, it's interesting, Noel Pearson sort of talking about the naysayers and the people who don't want to intervene. I don't know where those people are.
One's the Chief Minister of the Australian Capital Territory, of course.
And the other's the age newspaper.
Everyone is saying something should be done.
There's a lovely little club of them there. Don't deny that there weren't.
But Karen, don't you think that if you get bogged down in the debate about process, you actually jeopardise the ultimate goal, and that's the problem.
And that is why there is the hesitation from Labor, and fair enough. Everyone should accept that something has to be done. And I agree with the person talking before that, of course, we're relieved that something is being done, and in a sense, you need a dramatic intervention to put this front and centre. There will be arguments about whether you are making things better or worse, and that will have to.
Barry,
they are discussions.
Can I say, in terms of the argument about process, I mean, I think the government has won the moral argument. I think that's done and dusted. We are now arguing about process. But for those critics who do, say that John Howard's racist in doing this, I mean, political decision-making is about critical mass. We talk a lot about the reports that came before this one, whether something should have been done earlier, whether John Howard's to blame for that. Can you imagine if John Howard 10 years ago had put the troops into communities? I mean, this was a bloke who was accused of being racist for not saying sorry.
But he also wasn't interested 10 years ago.
Imagine if he'd done it 10 years ago.
He did 10 years ago. 1997, Australian troops started going into Aboriginal communities, building roads, airports, toilet blocks, health. They've been there for 10 years. This is not new.
That is quite true.
Well, not on this scale, I don't think, surely.
Let's get some background and analysis now. Paul Kelly, as we speak, is winging his way back from Iraq and Afghanistan, and no doubt we'll read more about that during the week. But standing in for him this morning is the ABC's political correspondent, Jim Middleton. Jim, good morning. 1 week on, how do you think the whole exercise is going?
Look, Barry, for the Prime Minister, I think it's going very well. For the first time this year, he's been able to take the initiative in a way that he hasn't been able to ever since Kevin Rudd took over the leadership of the Labor Party. His attempts to get on the front foot, for instance, in January with the big water initiative, that didn't really get any traction for him. Equally, there was problems when he came up with his climate change scenario, no targets, etc., etc. But here, quite clearly, he's taking the initiative on an issue which grips the community at large. It's such a big issue that it also effectively, for a week and more now, has blotted out all the other political news that there is. So the focus has been very much on this issue. I noticed in the previous segment, in your shout, there was a person there talking about this being late and heavy-handed. Well, the question is, yes, it is late, but why that's also to an extent explains why it's heavy-handed. Why is it late? In part because the states and the territories have failed to effectively deal with their responsibilities in this issue. And I think that goes to another point in the Prime Minister's favour in this week, is that all the nitpicking on the part of the states, the carping and so on and so forth that we've seen from the Northern Territory and others, also plays into the Prime Minister's hands and works indeed against Kevin Rudd. I suspect that the Aboriginal community will want to pay on results with this issue, and there is a problem for the Prime Minister in the detail unwinding. Personnel, it would seem to me, is a massive problem. Seen the Labor Party through Jenny Macklin this morning trying to steal a bit of a march there with additional teachers for the Northern Territory. Where they're going to come from, God knows where indeed the police are going to, additional police that are going to be needed, are going to come from. As I say, the Aboriginal community will probably pay on results, but I think the broad community will applaud the decisiveness.
But you talk about the nitpicking that's going on. Federal Labor is certainly, as you say, you said the states are doing it, not Federal Labor, and Federal Labor is, they face a tough tactical game in all of this, don't they?
They do indeed. This is not a time bomb so much as possibly a hand grenade for Kevin Rudd. Not only has he been sidelined in a way that he hasn't been so far this year, behaving for the first time like an opposition leader, an addendum to the story rather than being the story, but he's also, so instead of being the alternative Prime Minister, he's been much more like an opposition leader, a traditional opposition leader. That's poison if you want to want to win government. There's also a problem, I think, excuse me, for the Labor Party internally and also within parts of its constituency that I don't think that John Howard faces. That is, that both within the Liberal and National parties and also among the voters that the Prime Minister needs to hold on to win his next victory, there would be broad support for the drastic action and not much concern about the detail. Within the Labor Party there would be at least two schools of thought. One is to go along with the Prime Minister, but there are others who are going to find it very, very difficult and very, very unpalatable. And also that goes for the Labor Party's constituency out in Voterland too. So I think it is a very, very difficult issue for the Labor Party. The opposition leader, Kevin Rudd, can't be seen to be leading on this as he has done on so many other issues this year, and it has the potential also to divide both the party and the constituency.
And it's also equally a test, I think, for the Aboriginal leadership.
Indeed it is. Look, there's no doubt that for eons now, the dominant community in Australia has treated the Aboriginal society and Aboriginal culture appallingly, but there have been opportunities that have been won by Aboriginal leadership, the period of self-determination with ATSIC, and also the opportunities provided after that great battle over Mabo and Wick. But it has to be said that in the process leading from those sorts of victories, that the ball has certainly been dropped to a certain extent, and you can see Noel Pearson's frustration, for example, where he picks at the naysayers, where he points to the fact that, as he said just yesterday, telling John Howard and the states and territories, don't you understand, 90% of your programs as far as Aborigines are concerned have failed. They're pointless, they haven't worked. The virtue, he says, of what is happening now, this drastic action now, is that it is decisive. Now, the question for Aboriginal leadership is, I guess at this point, is whether they get on board and accept that yes, they can look at the detail, but the fact that they have to recognise their own failures in terms of what has happened and how we've come to this parlous position. The question is whether, in the longer term, this assists the economic and social integration of some of the most bereft people in our community into the broader society, or where we're left in certain circumstances with nothing other, Barry, than a kind of criminal separatism, which is disastrous for so many young children.
Jim Middleton, thank you for that. And look, you made the point before, Glenn, that it's about process. It's also about style and how you go about it. And there has been some criticism of that from Rex Wild QC. And I want you to look at what Tony Abbott had to say on this. The day after they made the announcement, this was where he put the emphasis in an interview on the Today Show.
What we need is not just better health services. What we need is law and order in these communities. We need to get the police in the booze out. We've had a surfeit, if you like, of social work and not enough law and order in these communities, and that's what the federal government's determined to achieve.
Now, I'm sure a lot of people agree with that, but it seems to me he's the health minister. This was the day after, and that's where he put the emphasis.
Yeah, I don't think it was right, and that's one reason why there was a certain amount of apprehension, particularly in the communities, when you had government leaders saying things like that, as if, you know, let's send in the coppers with the batons, we'll work it out.
Yeah, but that's not what happened, Malcolm.
But
since
that's the
then,
message.
Since then,
well, but I think he's right. I mean, the fact is, the threshold question is law and order because nothing else follows unless that's established. I think that's screamingly obvious.
There are others who say, well, that's true, that's an immediate problem, but there are others who say the threshold question is education. You talk to an awful lot of people.
Yeah, but Karen, we have been education for years, you know, as Jim pointed out, for years and eons.
and as we said, the dramatic nature of this intervention is important because it's a declaration that something's going to be done. You can stabilise communities immediately, but you have to look at long-term strategies, and this is one of the queries about this approach is where is the follow-up? Is there a follow-up plan in place, or are we sort of scrambling? And that's the danger, that if we are scrambling, what comes next? And we really don't want to waste this opportunity of the dramatic intervention.
Yeah, but I make the point, I mean, building a school is not going to save a child from sex abuse.
No, but you have to get the child to go to the school. You've got to build the school, the child has to go to the school.
But the immediate problem is to stop the abuse.
Well,
yes, so what has happened here is that it opens up a Pandora's box now. Like the whole issue and every aspect of Aboriginal life is now out there for debate. And that was unavoidable. I mean, the moment that you made such a dramatic gesture as this, that's there. And then when Mel Bruff said yesterday, to your point, about it needs a longer-term solution, he said, tell that to the kids who are being abused. But it needs both.
It does need both, and that's the complexity of this issue, and that's why we've gone around and around and around. Now we've got the short-term intervention. Fantastic. Let's not waste the opportunity, and let's make sure that it's done correctly. And I think one of the disappointing things is the lack of consultation. It has created a suspicion in some parts of the Aboriginal community that this is yet another solution being imposed, and that's where you're undermining the dramatic nature of it almost.
Yeah, but they're also, don't you think, Karen, they're undermining the rights agenda by their own behaviour. I mean, Noel Pearson made the point this week, Barry, you know, that the rights agenda has meant the right to party, the right to booze, you know, the right to criminal violence. I mean, the rights agenda is gone.
Jim Middleton had a very telling phrase, I thought, the criminal separatists, and a little bit of hyperbole, but you get what he's saying. How dare you come in here and stop me promoting physical and community abuse.
I don't think the rights agenda is gone. I mean, I think that we're talking about land rights and all, and the associated questions about that. I still don't understand why this is being connected with removal of land rights. I haven't heard a good explanation from the government for that. Jenny Macklin was right, I think, to say, well, let's hear exactly why we need to remove...
And not only an explanation on why it's necessary, but how it will work. We'll pick up on that, first of all, with some criticism of it from within the Aboriginal community.
We are totally against tying serious social needs to our hard-fought land ownership and land tenure. We believe that this government is using child sexual abuse as the Trojan horse to resume total control of our lands.
It is an absolute alibi to try and characterise this debate as being about land grabs and so on. Who wants a land grab in Main Street, Hopevale, for goodness sake?
Well, exactly right. I mean, and this goes to the core argument, I think, in the post-Mabo and the post-Wick era. I mean, the fact is that all they got was marginal land in the end. By the very nature of those High Court decisions, they've been pushed to the edges of society, and it doesn't work.
But why further attempt to remove what rights there are in conjunction with this issue? Let's see exactly what is to be gained.
No, but you see, I think this is the next step, and that you're right that you have to address this. But the fact is, the government's going to address it by saying you can buy your own homes.
Exactly.
They're going to end the collectivisation
in the long term. If you go to the Solomon Islands and Papua New Guinea, you see one of the great impediments to economic development there, communal land ownership.
Exactly.
If you want to build a hotel or a factory on the Solomon Islands, you've got to consult with 5 or 6 different groups. It takes years, it costs a lot of money.
So why is that the only long-term thing that they're trying to do in part of this?
Hey, if you allow individual freehold... No, I'm just sorry. I didn't want to interrupt your interruption. If you allow individual freehold within that community, you've got a better chance of economic development, better chance of getting jobs, taxes for schools, hospitals, etc.
Surely, Barry, if collectives worked, we'd all live in them.
But aren't you putting the cart? Aren't you putting the cart before the horse? You're arguing the immediacy of the need to fix these communities up, and yet you're attaching one long-term strategy, which is about.
It's a long-term strategy.
But they're also multi-strand too, Karen. I mean, the fact is that billions are being spent on other things, and will continue to be spent on other things.
Isn't part of the problem here, though, confusion? That as Karen said, there's been no answer yet to why it's necessary. But the first time the Prime Minister was really asked to detail this and explain how it's going to work, he got this response on 3OW.
Prime Minister, what about their land? What happens to their land?
Well, we are taking over the administration of these areas, and
for how long?
Well, for a period of years, and we'll just see how the process works out. And
do you guarantee to give it back?
Well, we're not going to take anybody's land without just compensation, and I made that very clear.
So could it be an effect of it? It's not the aim, but could it be an effect of it that the land is removed from the Aborigines and they're compensated?
Well, that's not the aim.
Now, you see, that's not... But then later on that day, that very same day, he was really emphatic and said, no, this is a 5-year lease, and then we hand it back. Mm-hmm. So, again, they're sort of figuring this out as they go, and you can understand that to an extent. Yep. But the same thing with the health checks. It started out being compulsory. Tony Abbott was saying one thing, Mel Brough the other, and it took a couple of days to sort it all out.
Mm. And it creates confusion, and that creates suspicion, and that is what's disappointing. The sort of need to have the secrecy beforehand, the non-consultation. I mean, the Prime Minister spent some time in the company of an Indigenous person the very night before he made his announcement, and he actively did not mention this. And he deliberately didn't mention it. Now, I'm sorry, that gives rise to the feeling that there was politics associated with the nature of the announcement, and it's disappointing because it removes an opportunity for everyone to work together.
But I also think the debate about compulsory checks is a phony one, in the sense that you have mandatory reporting requirements in mainstream society. I mean, if a doctor examines a child, we've got to trust the doctor that if there's signs of interference, then they'll report it. I mean, the other point to make, though, is that without the compulsory nature of it, if a mother brings a child in who's been interfered with and she's been biffed at home, as Noel Pearson says, she's hardly likely to give permission to the doctor to examine the child properly.
But is she? You know, you read, there's a story...
Oh, well, they are, Karen, clearly.
Is she hardly likely to give permission? You read some of the stories of journalists who've now gone out and interviewed, one of the papers today, Yuendamu. The women there are saying, we would happily have our children examined.
Well, why is it going on then?
Because it's good for... Because there aren't the doctors there doing it.
And they haven't got the protection from the police.
Right, now maybe there is protection.
Well, that's Tony Abbott's point.
Yes. So, well, I just think his tone was wrong.
We can argue about Tony's tone.
I also want to raise now the question of double standards and whether they exist across the board. Certainly one caller again on Melbourne Radio this week felt that there was a double standard.
What I would like to ask about is the church, the way they have abused children, and the way they have been treated, and the way the Aboriginal people are being treated.
It has been a small minority, but it has brought great damage to the reputation of the church, and I feel sorry many times for the hundreds of retired teaching brothers from orders like the Christian Brothers and so forth, whose whole order's reputation has been besmirched.
Now notice the word there, sorry, and he was sorry for the Christian Brothers, the innocent Christian Brothers. He didn't make the same comment about the Aborigines, who are a lot of male Aborigines who are caught up in this as well.
This is one of the things that even Noel Pearson is saying, that is unfairly besmirching the reputations of many Aboriginal people, Aboriginal men in particular, who have been doing the right thing, and Aboriginal women who've been caring for their children. There are a lot of people who are caring for their children properly in these communities, and there are families in crisis. And what we are seeing is the besmirching of all Aboriginal people, and no consideration for that, and a lack of respect for what they think. That's the bottom line in the approach.
Surely, though, you've got to take the part of the victims, don't you, and say, well, if a few reputations are besmirched, I'd rather save a child.
But we don't seem to worry about that so much with the Catholic Church, or with, I really do think it's a problem. I do think it's a problem. Sorry. There is a double. I think there is a double standard in the way the Prime Minister.
You mean child molesters outside Aboriginal communities get a pretty good run?
No. I'm saying the double standard.
Have you read the Daily Telegraph?
You're misunderstanding me. I'm saying that the issue of the double standard that was being addressed with the Prime Minister's response is legitimate.
Malcolm, I'll give you another example. Right, we'll go further on this whole question of double standards. I want to refer you first of all to a Bulletin article by Paul Toohey. This is what he wrote. Several weeks ago in Katherine, a 16-year-old boy was charged with having sex with a 14-year-old girl who had a baby to him. They were too young, but it was consensual. The girl made no complaint about her boyfriend, but a government worker did. Now the boy faces charges that carry up to 16 years jail. Now, by way of contrast, what happens to white minors who are guilty of the same or similar offences? Here's Rex Wild QC, author of that report that got all this going.
We were told that they were concerned that their young children, and these are kids between the ages of 12 and 15, were visiting minors' accommodation and were doing things which they shouldn't be doing, acting immorally.
Were they already aware that their staff were involved in child abuse?
Yes, they were aware of the problem and they were dealing with it as they saw best. It certainly involved any minors who were caught acting inappropriately being removed immediately from the company and sent back home.
This is another issue, and this is again in the papers today, the issue of the level of sexual activity, consensual sexual activity, if such a thing exists for minors, and we say in the general legal community that it doesn't, it can't be consensual if it's underage.
You mean minors as in?
Juniors, sorry, small, young children. The problem is there's a high level of sexual activity among young children in Indigenous communities, and differentiating between...
Why, Karen?
Well, it's wrong and it's bad and it should be stopped.
But hang on, was it good enough for the mining companies to say, right, we know this is going on, we'll just send these guys home?
No, absolutely not. They ought to be charged.
They should have informed the police of it.
Yes, exactly. And I will say to the Prime Minister's credit, I mean, Rex Wild having highlighted that, he is now going to meet with the mining companies and say what's going on.
Well, I want to go, just to sum up on this whole issue now, to a sort of multiple choice question, if you like, I suppose, to see whether you think there's any legitimacy in some of the comparisons that have been put. Can the government's intervention be compared with any, all or none of the above? We'll have a look, first of all, Cyclone Katrina, and that's as the Prime Minister has suggested, of course. The Murray-Darling Initiative, you've heard the criticisms, all too rushed, no consultation. The Iraq War, no exit strategy in that case, I guess, and the Tampa. Now, that's from those who question the motivation. Now, all of those issues, those comparisons that have been raised, do you see any value in going through any one of them?
Well, I'll take none of the above.
Yeah.
But if I can speak to the Tampa issue for a second, Barry, I mean, the question of wedge politics here just fascinates me, because you've got to want to wedge somebody, and can I tell you, Kevin Rudd was never going to be wedged on this. I mean, he's a social conservative who's been compared to a younger version of John Howard, so there was no chance of ever wedging him. And can you tell me any election in Australia that's ever been won on the issue of Aboriginal affairs? I'm sorry, I just don't see where this issue arises.
I think where the politics of this come in, if that's what we're getting to, is that this has allowed the Prime Minister to be seen as decisive, and that's a word Noel Pearson has used several times lately. He needed to be on the front foot. So what we've got is an issue that needed to be addressed, and he has seen that this is a good time to address it. It's a question of whether it was going to be disadvantageous to him to address it in this way, and I think he's decided no. There is a secondary benefit to him, which is that he is dominating the media and he is in front on an issue.
But don't you think, Karen, that we have to separate out the image politics, if you like, and the issue here? I mean, it does benefit John Howard, but I think it's inadvertent. I mean, if we're suggesting that John Howard thinks he can win an election on the issue by exploiting child sex abuse, I reckon we should all go home.
And may I dare suggest that there's a paradigm here that we might be missing, and undoubtedly there are political benefits for Howard. But I think if you look at three things he's done this year, one is the Murray-Darling Basin management bid. The second is the Indigenous thing. The third thing, just recently, is the respite care. Essentially, all three were state matters that he's poured a lot of money in. I don't think this is so much a consequence of an election year, but a consequence of having a budget where the dollars are falling off the trucks as they roll into Treasury.
Hang on, you mentioned those two. Isn't there something in common with the Murray-Darling Initiative and this one, and that it may have been done in haste? And there wasn't enough consultation either with the departments, his own government departments, or with people in the field?
That's what I'm saying. That it was an opportunity driven not by the electoral cycle, but by the revenue cycle. And also his overall philosophy about federalism.
No,
I was going to say, there's one other thing in common there. He's kicking down the door of the states.
Exactly. He's annexing bit by bit.
I don't think you can say that it wasn't driven by the electoral cycle. I mean, come on. I mean, of course it's driven by the electoral cycle, as well as the fact that he's got the money. He can do these things now. He hasn't chosen to do them previously. He can
'Cause
do
he hasn't
them
had the
now.
money.
Well, he hasn't had the money.
Are you
but let's
suggesting
not,
that,
let's
really,
not
Karen,
rule out
are
the
you
electoral
suggesting
cycle.
that the response on child sexual abuse in Indigenous communities has been driven by the electoral cycle?
I think all of these responses have been driven, at least in part, by the electoral cycle, and sadly, that's the way Australian
Well, you
politics
can make
work.
the argument that the fact that he gets out of bed in the morning is driven by
Well,
the electoral
and
cycle.
it is
You
with
can
John
take it too.
Howard. That's true.
You mentioned, Malcolm,
it's
you
very
mentioned,
true.
Malcolm, that the key responsibility in so many of these cases rests with the states.
Yeah.
Could there then be an opportunity, if that's the right word, for Kevin Rudd in all of this, if it all goes pear-shaped? He's the guy who says, well, look, I can be the Labor Prime Minister, I can talk to the Labor states and we'll make that an issue.
Well, that's true, potentially. He could say, well, we're all on the same team, we can work better together.
Yeah,
but
however,
the premiers are falling into line on this
I'd
now.
say one of the central failings of this whole debate, and I think Jenny Macklin actually honestly touched on it this morning when she said it's all our fault. And really, you know, Federal Labor has sat back and ignored all these state reports on child abuse because they're Labor governments.
Everybody has. Everybody has.
All right, just switching topics now, and there's a reference in one of the papers this morning, I think the Telegraph, on Iraq and the suggestion that there might be somewhere deep in the bowels of government a plan to start withdrawing troops by February. Let's first of all have a look at, I think, was a really significant contribution from Senator Richard Lugar, a key Republican, probably the key Republican on foreign policy in the United States, who had this to say.
Our course in Iraq has lost contact with our vital national security interests in the Middle East and beyond. A course change should happen now.
That was a significant comment. Now, would there be some nervousness within the government that if they're not careful, George Bush will move before John Howard?
Well, I don't think George Bush is going to move before John Howard, but I think this debate is shifting very quickly under John Howard. And my view is that I think the opposition, and we saw Jenny Macklin doing this morning, is framing John Howard on this. They're setting up the circumstances and the climate in which they're saying John Howard is going to move because he's been forced to by comments like that.
And Jenny Macklin was saying something different. She was saying, don't believe him on this.
Well,
this is what he said before the last
Well,
meeting.
I was going to say, that's what that is. That is a bet each way. Yes.
Yeah.
Well, but why is it? I mean, why is it a political problem for John Howard if the Americans move first? I mean, he can't be seen to be moving. He's boxed himself in. He doesn't want to move ahead of the Americans, but if they do move, then that gives him an opportunity to shift his position, and he'd probably like to before the election.
Yes, except that there was, I think, a congressional report out this week which said that the circumstances, the context in which both sides have said they won't move until the Iraqi security forces are up and running doesn't exist.
The difficulty for John Howard and the government here, I think, is that the Americans aren't operating according to our political cycle.
No.
They'll be operating according to the elections at the end of next year in the United States.
That's right. That's right.
So now, you were saying before, Malcolm, that a lot of issues have been washed away as a result of the Aboriginal issue, but health. People still list that as the number one issue in a lot of surveys you get. Now, there were initiatives on both sides of politics this week. The Prime Minister on disabilities, the Labor Party is saying it's about preventative health.
Not a lot of detail, though, in the Labor Party announcement. It was a flagging of an idea, but there was no detail about how
The
to
aged care initiative was interesting yesterday at the State Labor Conference, I thought, in Queensland. I mean, quite a smart idea. You know, zero interest loans for aged care providers to get extra beds. Stuff like that, smart thinking.
And with the disability money too, it was picking up on this idea of conditional money. You know, we'll give you the $1,000, but you must spend it on essentials, something that will help you in your everyday life.
Look, you cannot underestimate the strength of this issue among backbenchers on both sides of Parliament, because they hear firsthand the tragic stories, particularly of elderly people looking after adult disabled children, and they do it without a break. I once went to with Bob Carr years ago, opening a respite centre in Port Macquarie, and there was this woman brought her husband, Alzheimer's husband, and it was the first break just to go shopping with the girls, have a cup of coffee, and she was just guilt-torn and traumatised by the fact it was so awful. And this is going on day after day after day, and Howard should be marked up for that, and the states for backing him.
And he's personally quite touched by that. I know he's had some contact with constituents, particularly the elderly who have disabled children who are getting into middle age and who are just distraught at the prospect that they will die and leave their child with no care. And he feels that very strongly, I know, and that's part of the reason he's moved.
Karen Middleton, Malcolm Farr and Glen Milne will be back in a few minutes, but time now for Mike Bowers and his regular segment, Talking Pictures.
Michael Bowers and I'm pictorial editor with the Sydney Morning Herald. I'm talking pictures this morning with cartoonist and artist for News Limited, Eric Lebecki. Well, this week the cartoonists were pretty much fixated on the federal government's controversial new measures to tackle the problems in the Northern Territory's Indigenous communities, and most of you, I think, were asking the same question.
Yeah, well, you know, it was basically a whitewash this week. Basically, all we had to draw was the Aboriginal issue, yeah.
Sean Leahy, who cartoons for the Courier Mail up in Brisbane, he's drawn 96 with the Prime Minister asleep. It's a national disgrace. And then Rip Van Howard wakes up in 2007 with It's a National Emergency.
I think he's meant to be the Messiah there, is he, or something, yeah? And that's what's happening,
The
really.
sleeping Messiah, yeah. I just love this David Rowe in the Financial Review called Walkabout with the Prime Minister taking a very circuitous route in his tracksuit here, and here's Noel Pearson and the Prime Minister saying, OK, so what are we waiting for? Let's get into it, basically.
That's right. And, yeah, well, he had Noel Pearson as an ally with this issue.
Tough love, the Bill Leak. It's a very beautifully drawn cartoon. Shut up and behave yourselves, you the pair of yous, having their heads together.
The old Tintin.
Eric, you've done a pretty powerful illustration here of the whole thing. Run us through what's going on here.
Yeah, well, it's not really funny, really. It's a hand coming down on the Aboriginal child, and well, it's a government or a bureaucrat stopping it. Now, I drew that as a black hand, and then decided, well, it was more about the different issues that needed to be talked about. Alcoholism and the pedophilia thing. So it's all about the evil coming down on these poor little kids.
Andrew Dyson has picked up on the census, which was released this week. One of them asking what's ageing, which is pretty powerful because I think the life expectancy is well underneath white Australia.
Yeah, that's right.
Many people have been calling it the new Tampa. And Jeff Price got the doctor with Kevin Rudd in bed saying severe head dizziness, blood pressure way up, laboured breathing, tingling sensation in the fingers and toes, pulse irregular, tightness across the chest. I reckon we're looking at a Tampa attack.
Yeah, well, and look at poor Rudd. He's going, oh no.
I just thought Bruce Petty, in the wonderful way that he does, summed up all the very different issues just beautifully with, he's got dispossession, stolen children, deaths in custody, porn, alcohol, overcrowded houses, extinguished title, and then he's got the Prime Minister here telling the Aboriginal community, as intervention has clearly failed, here's some more of it.
And it works, doesn't it? I mean, it's basically it depicts the whole story. And you know, you must have been scribbling away for minutes there. Yeah. Absolute minutes. And the beauty about it is he uses more liquid paper than actually he draws. I mean, his liquid paper is phenomenal when you look at his actual artwork.
Zanetti's drawn the political football with the poor little child getting kicked around between activists, a lovely little Peter Beattie here at the Commonwealth, and the family and the kids saying so much for ending child abuse.
Yeah, that's right. And they all look like little thugs, don't they? Yeah.
Putting their boot in. Mark Knight, as he does with some of these very heavy issues, he's drawn quite a poignant cartoon with Australia's Hurricane Katrina and the families on the roof of the house drowning in a sea of grog here.
Yeah, and Aboriginal land, no entry, you know, but there they are, they're coming in now.
Yeah.
Yeah, with the choppers and everything. And that also is a scary thing for them as well, you know, I mean, like, they're coming in and what's going to happen sort of thing.
It was a pretty heavy week. Look, it's always a great pleasure talking to you, Eric. Thanks very much for taking the time.
Yeah, thank you very much.
And Karen, just to clear up a matter, when I suggested before the disability, the $1,000 lump sum payment, in the end, isn't linked to anything in particular?
No, the Prime Minister actually said when he announced it that they thought about making that conditional, but they decided that people who cared for disabled children knew best how to spend their money and there weren't conditions on it.
I don't know whether it's escaped some people's attention, but we should be on election alert as of this week. Because if the Prime Minister is to go on the very first available date, that is August the 4th, then he would need to call it at the end of this week.
Well, that's right. I mean, we're weeks away now. I mean, we're 12 weeks away, if you like.
July the 1st, we're over the hump.
It could be
today.
5 weeks away
well,
if the Prime Minister wanted to take the very first opportunity.
That's right.
But of course, and this is a really unusual election year in that sense. There is no election speculation, never has been, because I think people accept right across the board, certainly in the media, that when the Prime Minister says he's hosting APEC, he means it.
Yeah, it's interesting, Barry. He's going to face a dilemma if as we discussed, image versus process here about the Aboriginal issue gives him some poll momentum. If those polls tighten to about 4%, which would be a big ask. But if the momentum was going his way, he's going to have to ponder whether to puncture that momentum with hosting APEC.
I talked to a couple of people on Friday who actually said, no, it's not out of the question to go before APEC. And the way somebody put it was that psychologically they actually think that the Prime Minister would probably rather have it out of the way, presuming that he wins, before APEC. And they do have momentum from this now, and they must be looking at the polls over the next week or two.
A lot of ground to make up, though.
And to see how you would balance that, and you would lose momentum from APEC. APEC is going to be diabolically bad for the people of Sydney, and you've got a couple of leaders who are staying on. Well, potentially.
For those people living between Pyrmont and Potts Point,
which is
none of whom read the Daily Telegraph.
So we won't have wall-to-wall coverage of the outrageous security in the Daily Telegraph, is that right?
It might be a minor inconvenience. And it'll be for 3 days. Then there are the state visits from Bush, Harper, etc. And
from Japan.
And Parliament will be sitting at least for one of the 2 scheduled weeks after APEC, so that they can these people can address Parliament. And I would say that you put on your running spikes when Parliament gets up after that. Those 2 weeks.
Well, they've got their running spikes on now. In fact, they've been out and about in the electorate. We'll have a look at some shots of John Howard. Looking very much the father of the nation.
Worried father of the nation.
Of course, the strategy is to go out and try and win 1 seat at a time. That's what the marginal seat strategy is about, and that's what both he and Kevin Rudd are doing this week.
Well, there are pockets. There are going to be pockets that you need to concentrate on, pockets in Western Australia, pockets in Queensland, and certain seats that they're going to have to pay a lot of attention.
Well, of course, if we doubted that Queensland was important, we saw yesterday a $25 million announcement to move Australian Rugby Union headquarters there, so we now know it's a problem for the government.
And it's important for Kevin Rudd, of course, when he's in Queensland, to keep it local, as he was doing this week. In fact, what he did, just as a precursor to this, he gave an local ABC radio station a few minutes' notice that he was popping in for an interview, and this was part of it.
Good morning, Jane from Ravenshoe. Ravenshoe's got some schools up there, haven't they? Yeah. I think I might be wrong on this, but I think my wife's brother went to school in Ravenshoe. Yeah, I'll certainly be back in Cairns. It's a wonderful place to be. Just walking down by the where the tourism boats are operating this morning, it's just, you can almost feel far north Queensland seep into your bones just by being out there for a half an hour wandering around. It's just terrific.
That's the way to do it.
Yes, that school, wasn't that where I shot the commercial?
Well, he went to Ballarat, for example, and was talking there about funding a war memorial. I think the war memorial has been funded. It's a question of whether it's going to be recognised nationally. He said it would be under Labor. I mean, that's what happens in this part of the cycle.
That's right.
In the weeks
Every
before.
stop is a giveaway.
Yep. Just quickly, Warren Mundine in a column this week said, look, I hate the Prime Minister, but I support him on what he's doing in the Aboriginal areas. And of course, the emphasis for them was, well, hang on, I hate the Prime Minister. It wasn't all that clever, was it, for one of the party presidents who's in this sort of hurdy-gurdy?
When you're trying to appeal to 2 constituencies in the one piece, I guess you've got to go to that sort of extreme. But that's mere bagatelle, I guess, to Mundine's endorsement of the overall project.
OK, let's have a final observation or a prediction, Karen.
Our 2 colleagues, Michael Harvey and Jared McManus from the Herald Sun, were convicted of contempt of court. Luckily, they didn't go to jail. They have been fined $7,000 and they have criminal convictions, which will restrict their activities in future. They were writing stories that were in the national interest, but public's right to know, and I think governments have to act to put legislation in place to protect journalists from this kind of conviction, because we're doing what the public needs and wants.
And the Victorian government has now been invited to overturn this conviction. Do you think they will?
Well, they said they're considering it. I mean, it's all a little bit after the horse has bolted for Harvey and McManus.
No, it's very important for Harvey and McManus because you don't want a criminal offence against you when they travel as extensively as they do.
But I mean, the federal government's gesture is a little bit after the horse has bolted.
Yep,
It was them that set this in train in the first place, but it would be welcome. Yeah.
Welcome.
80,000 people went to the Melbourne cricket ground to watch a terrific game of rugby union. Channel 7 had the rights to that game, but instead ran Starsky and Hutch. There must be a re-examination of AAU media rights to insert a Melbourne clause.
That's offsiders next.
Treasurer Peter Costello's Chief of Staff, Phil Gaetjens, one of nature's gentlemen, run down in a hit-run incident outside Parliament House on Friday night, badly injured, and look, all our thoughts and prayers with him and his family for a speedy recovery.
Absolutely. And just a final observation from Tony Blair, who met this week with Arnold Schwarzenegger.
My press officer said to me, whatever else you do this morning,
Don't say, I'll be back. This will be gravely misinterpreted. Nice to see you all.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
And that's a program, and I'll be back with Offsiders at 10:30. And now come out next, Alan Kohler and Inside Business.